right. Thank you. Thank you for coming tonight. Thank you for having me to speak with you. I was all ready to do this talk, and I had been putting this presentation together for, it seemed like months and months now. And I had a really hard time. I was down visiting my dad in Louisiana. I had a really hard time getting back yesterday. But I finally made it, the last flight from Charlotte to Wilmington. So I was really ready to give this presentation. And then I saw Angie Zombach and Chris Fonville walking down. I'm like, oh my God, there's real actual history professors here. So I was going to start off by telling you a little bit about myself. For those of you that don't know me, my name's Chris Langlois. I'm originally from South Louisiana. I spent 25 years in Omaha, Nebraska, though. I spent 38 years in the fire service and retired last year, like a few days ago last year. And then ended up moving here before I retired a year ago from being the fire chief and public safety director in Leland, for the town of Leland. So I thought this was a good opportunity. I've never done this presentation before. I just put it together over the last few months. It seemed like Bill said when he was doing the sickles at Gettysburg, it seemed like it was months and months you were putting that thing together. I felt the same kind of way with this. And just finally got it to a point where, okay, this is what I'm gonna present. So, giving the disclaimer, I am not a historian, but I do have a love of history, especially the American Civil War, since I was 18 or 19. So what I can do, though, one of my favorite podcasts always talks about how the last 5 letters in the word history is story. So what I want to do tonight is just tell a story about the Bayou Teche Campaign of 1863. Is this going to work? Yes, it works. Okay. So some of the Civil War in Louisiana, there wasn't a whole lot, but there were some significant things that happened in Louisiana during the Civil War. Particularly, everybody's heard about, the occupation of New Orleans, the 1864 Red River Campaign, battles of Mansfield and Pleasant Hill. Of course, everything happened opposite of Vicksburg, and then of course one of the largest areas is Port Hudson. Has anybody ever been to Port Hudson State Historic Site? Excellent state historic site. If you're ever going up there, going to the Vicksburg area, make a little trip down to the Port Hudson area. They have a really good state historic area. So things happened during the Civil War in Louisiana, but why did I pick this particular subject, the battles of Fort? Has anybody ever heard of the battles of Fort Bisland and Irish Bend? Have you really? I would never expect that anybody would have heard of that. I heard of it growing up because I grew up in this area, but didn't really know a lot about what happened. I knew some things about it, but not a whole lot of the details. But some of the reasons that I decided to do this particular one is the connections that I have to it. Number one, I grew up probably about 20 miles from where these actually happened in that area. I grew up in a small town called Jeanerette. I'll show you that here on some of the maps that we'll talk about tonight. But I was also a reenactor back in the 80s when I was 18, 19, 20 years old. And as a federal unit, we reenacted the infantry, which was at the Battle of Fort Bisland with the Army of the Gulf. So that kind of drew me to it as well. So I had some background with that. And then I also had a family background to a unit that fought at the Battle of Fort Bisland. So here is this is my great-grandfather, Joseph Levinsky Revet, who was a private in the 18th Louisiana Infantry. He did not fight in this battle. He joined a little bit later on, 1864, and he was present at the Red River Campaign. But the 18th Louisiana fought at Fort Bisland. They were present at that battle. They were present at Shiloh and some other battles. This is Adelaide Revet. So this is my great-grandfather, and this is my great-aunt. And you can see here, she was born in 1918, and he died in 1927. This is his daughter. So she died in 2005. I actually got to meet her and sit down and talk with her, an actual child of a Civil War soldier, and make that connection. So although he was not at these battles, his unit that he later served with, and he joined when he was, I think, 15 or 16 years old. So he was fairly young when he joined the 18th Louisiana. So I had these connections to this, and I'm from that area, so I figured, why don't I talk a little bit or tell the story of the Bayou Teche Campaign? I didn't think very many people here were familiar with it, so it would be something a little bit new and something a little bit different. So starting out with a little bit of background, 1862 in Louisiana with the Trans-Mississippi Department, looking at everything that was west of the Mississippi River, Louisiana, Arkansas, Texas, the Indian Territory. That was pretty far away from where Richmond was. So it was very difficult to coordinate operations in that area. So they set up a district there that could be operated in order to coordinate the operations here, get supplies coming through Texas, across the Mississippi. Of course, we have Vicksburg and Port Hudson, with the Confederacy trying to hold on to the Mississippi River at this point to keep those supplies moving. 1862, the operations in Louisiana. As we know, the New Orleans was captured May 1st by General Butler, Benjamin Butler, and Flag Officer David Farragut with the assistance of David Porter. And that was also some of the connections I saw on this too, with Butler and Porter being here and then later on at Fort Fisher. And there were some other officers that we'll talk about a little bit later that were also at Fort Fisher. But at this time, New Orleans is captured. They moved the capital of Louisiana from Baton Rouge to Opelousas. Anybody ever heard of Opelousas? Pretty small town. It was a really small town back then. Moved the state capital from Baton Rouge to Opelousas. And the governor of Louisiana at the time, Governor Moore, called to Richmond and said, I need help. Most of the troops that were from Louisiana were serving in other parts of the Confederacy, in the Army of Tennessee, the Army of Northern Virginia. So there wasn't a whole lot of troops left here to the federal forces that were coming from New Orleans and threatening Port Hudson and threatening South Central Louisiana. So at that point, Richard Taylor for the Confederacy shows up, and Nathaniel Banks ends up replacing Butler. So the Army of Western Louisiana, Richard Taylor is sent from the Army of Northern Virginia. He was in command of the 2nd Louisiana Brigade. He was not a Louisiana native, but he owned a sugar plantation in St. Charles Parish. So he had some local knowledge. He served in the state legislature at one time. He was the son of Zachary Taylor, and he was Jefferson Davis's brother-in-law. So he had some connections. So Jefferson Davis picked him and sent him down here. Didn't send any more troops with him, but he said, go down and try and coordinate things down there. Try and start gathering up what you can. So we had an army, the Army of Western Louisiana, but it really consisted of only about 2 brigades. There was one that was led by Brigadier General Alexander Mouton, the Cajun general from down there, who was from that area, from Opelousas. His home was in Opelousas. In fact, when they moved the capital to Opelousas, they used his home as the state capital. He was previously the colonel of the 18th Louisiana, and at this point was getting over an injury that he had sustained at Shiloh. Most of the troops in his brigade, Mouton's brigade, were local troops from this area. One of the battalions was known as the Yellow Jacket Battalion because they wore these yellow distinctive jackets. And they were from the New Iberia area, a small town just north of where these battles happened. And they were known in that area. And I've never been able to find a connection, but the mascot for the local high school is the Yellow Jackets. But I've never been able to actually place those connections if that's where it came from. The other brigade commander for the Army of Western Virginia was Henry Sibley, a Natchitoches native, Natchitoches, Louisiana. Both Mouton and Sibley were West Point graduates. Richard Taylor was not. He was very interested in military history, but did not have a military background, did not go to West Point. Sibley, what else is Sibley, General Sibley known for? Anybody? This is a trivia for tonight. What's that?
New Mexico.
He was from, New Mexico. He had the Valverde artillery with him here. He was also known as the inventor of the Sibley tent, which basically looked like a round teepee, almost like American Indian type of tent. I've seen a few of those. So that's the Army of Western Louisiana. About 4,000 troops, probably more like 3,000. So not very significant, not a significant amount of troops that he had, but it is what it is. This is what he had to defend the area. The 19th Army Corps, the Army of the Gulf, Nathaniel Banks was sent here. He also did not have a military background, did not go to West Point, but he was a political general. He was a congressman, Speaker of the House, governor of Massachusetts, and he is just coming off a series of defeats by Stonewall Jackson in the Shenandoah Valley at this point. So they sent him down to South Louisiana to take over from Benjamin Butler, who was not really well-liked, I guess you could say, in New Orleans. Beast Butler. Nathaniel Banks, yes. Oh, gosh. How many times does it take to edit a book? Just those things. This is just a speaker. Well, he was with the National Army, so I will say that. That's the story, and I'm going to stick to it. But his own 19th Army Corps, which is part of the troops that were down there in New Orleans, consisted of 2 divisions and a brigade, led by Jeffrey Weitzel, who we know from Fort Fisher. And so we're seeing these connections to this area as well, Butler and Weitzel and Porter. And then 2 divisions led by William Emery and Cuvier Grover, who was known to be very aggressive. Especially, he was received some awards for bravery at Bull Run and Seven Pines. Now, Weitzel had been down there with Butler for a while, so he had reconnoitered the area, especially where this campaign was going to take place in the Bayou Teche area. So he knew the area, and he had come up with a strategy for what the Confederates were doing, and to adopt that strategy. Much larger force, about 16 to 18,000 is the number of troops that they had. So not a very good balance between the two. 1863, the goals and the objectives of Banks and the Army of the Gulf. So at this point, Banks' official orders was to secure the western side of the Mississippi River and coordinate with Grant, who was trying to see about operating against and investing Vicksburg. So Banks, his job was to try and clear that western side of the Mississippi River, coordinate with Grant as much as he could, and clear out the area of southern Louisiana, because they knew that Richard Taylor was down here trying to organize something, clear out this area. This time, before they started moving on Port Hudson, he was really trying to start to harass Banks and the Union forces that were in this area, trying to interfere with their communications. Couldn't do much against them, but he was harassing them. So Banks knew that if he moved on Port Hudson, he was going to leave his flank and his rear open to this continued harassment. So he needed to clear out South Central Louisiana of these Confederate forces, continue to protect New Orleans before moving on Port Hudson, try and cut Port Hudson's supply lines from the interior of the state, and destroy the salt mines at Petitance Island, which is now Avery Island. Who likes Tabasco sauce? If you look on the bottle, it says Avery Island, Louisiana. That's where these salt mines were. And it was the largest that had been found in the continental United States at that point. And it had just been located in May of 1862, so it was relatively new. But it was supplying salt to Port Hudson, Vicksburg, and areas that were east of the Mississippi River. So that was one of their goals. They wanted to get to this salt mine and destroy it. And they also wanted to capture supplies, sugarcane, cotton. One of the biggest crops down there is sugarcane, including not so much in southern Louisiana as far as cotton. Southern Louisiana was more tropical, more sugarcane. So they wanted to capture some of these things. And then he also is supposed to keep his eye towards Texas, if possibly. If they could capture Port Hudson, capture Vicksburg, secure the Mississippi River, they were wanting to start looking at moving towards Texas, if possible. And later on, he tried to do that in the Red River Campaign in 1864. Richard Taylor and the Army of Western Louisiana, they were on the defensive, really. They were going to try to be on the offense if they could, but they were really on the defensive. And his orders were to protect this Bayou Teche region. And I'll show you here in a little bit why it was so important. And protect the supplies, protect the agricultural supplies of Louisiana, protect the salt mine at Avery Island, and really disrupt and harass the Union lines and supplies and communications. That's really all he could do. And the only thing that he figured that he could do to help Port Hudson to maintain it was to try and divert Union troops away from it by harassing the Union lines, harassing their communications, protecting the supplies to Port Hudson, and threatening Union supplies and communications if they were to go up to Port Hudson to invest it. And he always had an eye that if Banks went to Port Hudson, he was going to try and sneak down and possibly threaten New Orleans and recapture New Orleans if he could. So that was one of his main goals, if he could do that. But with 3,000 or 4,000 troops, and it's all you got, it's limited what you can do. So here's a larger map of the area. So we see here the Mississippi River. All the way from New Orleans to Brashear City, which is now Morgan City in Louisiana. And that was their farthest area that they've moved west. So they controlled this area. However, Taylor, with General Mouton, had been harassing and raiding in this area. So they really wanted to clear the Confederates out of all of South Central Louisiana. Looking at defending this area was setting up a fort right here called Fort Bisland, named after the gentleman that owned the property. And I'll show you why it was so important to have it there and why this was the area that really needed to be defended. Banks, and especially Weitzel, when he had done some reconnoitering up in the area, had found that trying to take transports or boats up through Grand Lake, the Atchafalaya Basin, Atchafalaya Swamp, just and get around to where Port Hudson was. So this, what you see here, it looks like a long snake, is the Bayou Teche. And this is going to be the central highway for Banks to get up through South Central and ahead in Opelousas. There's Jeanerette, that's where I was born and raised. New Iberia is where I was actually born at the hospital, and if you went out of the back of the hospital and went about 100 yards, you were in the Bayou Teche. So literally right on the area. And then, anybody know where Lafayette is? Lafayette, Louisiana, probably a few. Back then it was called Vermilionville, and it's here, and that'll be significant later on. But Richard Taylor's defense really consisted of this fort here. So Banks had to figure out how he was going to get past this fort, and he also wanted to try and bag as much of Taylor's army as he possibly could to prevent them from harassing him later on. So this was Banks, really Weitzel's strategy, because he had been reconnoitering up in this area quite a bit and had come up with a strategy to oppose or to capture Fort Bisland. And it was really pretty daring. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this campaign, because it was relatively small, but it was very interesting. Things that they were going to try to do. It consisted of this grand kind of rear flanking maneuver and pincer maneuver to get the federal forces, to get Fort Bisland between and Taylor's army between them, an amphibious landing under fire coming off of the lake, and a lot of really interesting strategy and things that happened here, which makes it pretty interesting. This was Weitzel's strategy in the city now. Brashear City. Fort Bisland is here. And what they were going to do was a two-pronged approach. They were going to send part of the army, of the 19th Army Corps, directly against Fort Bisland, hold them as much as they can, making sure that they don't retreat until of gunboats and transports loaded with his 8,000-man division up Grand Lake, makes an amphibious landing off of Grand Lake to the Bayou Teche, across the bayou, gets on a bayou road that seems to be the only road that Taylor has to retreat down from Fort Bisland. If he were to retreat, there's a single road along the bayou going around and all the way back up towards New Iberia, Jeanneret, Lafayette, or Vermilionville. So they figure if they can get Grover's division directly across that road and take a left and come back towards Fort Bisland, they were in their rear and Taylor was cut off. And they could bag the entire army of Western Louisiana, as big as it was. That was the strategy. There's a but. There's always a big but in the strategy. It doesn't always work out great, but yeah, the rest of the strategy. So that's Wetzel's strategy. Banks liked it. He adopted it. So the Bayou Teche is the main real highway in this area. So Taylor had possession of several gunboats, the main one being the CSS Cotton in the Bayou Teche. And so gunboats started to play a really important role in this campaign. If you could get a gunboat on the bayou with troops and artillery on either side, you could do a lot. You could defend very easily, and you could attack very effectively, depending on what you're trying to do. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the operations of gunboats in the Bayou Teche. Some of the gunboats you see on the Teche were fairly unusual. The CSS Cotton was really a Mississippi passenger steamer that had been converted to a gunboat. The USS Diana, the federal forces had several gunboats. The Calhoun, the Diana, which you see up here. The Calhoun was the flagship, and the Estrella and Kinsman, along with several transports, flatboats, and other types of boats they had available to them. For example, the CSS Cotton, the primary gunboat, Confederate gunboat on the bayou, had one 32-pound and two 24-pound smoothbore guns and one 9-pound rifled gun on its decks. Most of these gunboats, that's what they were consisted of. They had artillery or on the decks that were manned by artillerists on the decks, which made them very prone to infantry on the banks of the bayou and artillery. The CSS Cotton had been used for quite a while to defend the area where Fort Bisland was going to be built until it could get built. You see this map. You see Fort Bisland here. Here's the Bayou Teche, the river coming over. Fort Bisland, there's part of the works on one side of it and part of the works on the other side of it. They did put some obstructions in the bayou to try to prevent federal gunboats from coming up the bayou, but their main defense at this point was the Cotton, and it did do a really good job. One of the advantages the Cotton had was the narrowness of the bayou. You can see this is a modern picture of the Bayou Teche here, and there's quite a few areas where the bayou is very narrow, and you can't get more than one boat up that area at one time. So at this point, we went up on November 3rd. 4 federal gunboats went up to challenge the Cotton. They outpowered and outgunned the Cotton, but because of the narrowness of the bayou, it was kind of the Spartans at Thermopylae kind of situation. They could only get one gunboat to fight the Cotton at one time, and the Cotton was able to. Confederate infantry also assisted on the banks, firing at the gunners on the decks of the federal gunboats. And the Cotton was successful in this instance on November 3rd in holding back the federal gunboats because Fort Bisland was not yet ready yet. It wasn't yet constructed, so it was able to hold them back at this point. However, January 14th, Wetzel has had enough of the Cotton, And so he sets out with the Federal gunboats, goes down the bayou, but he brings infantry and artillery with him. And their mission is to destroy or get rid of some kind of way the cotton, because it's what's standing in the way of them getting up the bayou. There's a significant battle on January 14th. During the battle, the commander of the Union flotilla was Thomas Buchanan. Lieutenant Commander Thomas Buchanan here was killed during the battle, shot in the head by a Confederate sharpshooter. And that was the issues that the gunners on the gunboats were really having. It wasn't necessarily the out of the gunboats, but it was the infantry that was taking out the gunners on the decks. Where do you go if you're on the deck? Unless you go inside, then you can't operate the guns. Union sharpshooters of the 8th Vermont were used to take out the Cotton's artillery gunners on their decks, and the Cotton was pushed back and had to go back towards Fort Bisland, back behind those obstructions that the Confederates had set in the bayou. So it was a victory, but the Cotton was not destroyed. The Cotton was not taken out. It was pushed back. So they had an idea that night after this January 14th battle. And in fact, it was the commander of the 8th Vermont that had the idea that setting up that night, I'm going to go back and kind of show you where that's at. Setting up a line of fires along the side of the bayou here to try and give the Confederates the impression that they had been reinforced that night with a large force. And it convinced the Confederates that the next day they were going to come up against the Cotton and the Confederates with a lot of force. And it worked. The Cotton, because of that, they decided that there's no way they could stand against this force that seemed to be reinforcing the Federals that night. They scuttled the Cotton, they set it on fire, and the Federals could see it coming down the bayou later that night. It turned sideways in the bayou, and there's a portrayal of the CSS Cotton set along the side of the bayou. They tried to set it up as another obstruction in the bayou if they could, but that was the end of the Cotton. So now the way is clear. The bayou is clear. The Federal gunboats can get up as far as Fort Bisland. The infantry is clear. They're not going to be harassed by a gunboat in the bayou. However, there's always a but. Later on, this is March 28th, you can see how we're kind of progressing farther into the spring of 1863. The USS Diana, one of the 4 gunboats that Banks had been out the day previous to March 28th. The captain of the Diana had heard that there was a plantation somewhere along the bayou that had a supply of sugar. He couldn't find it the day before, but the Confederates had heard that he was looking for it. So they took a chance. They set up along the bayou, and they set up an ambush the next day, hoping that he would come back looking for the sugar, which he did. He was assigned to reconnoiter Grand Lake, but he knew that sugar existed somewhere along the Bayou Teche at this plantation, and he sure enough went looking for it. So they ended up ambushing. It was an artillery unit and some infantry, Confederate infantry. Here's one of the quotes. Tells you how that went. This was by Lieutenant Pickering Allen, who was the aide-de-camp to General Weitzel. He said, "No human force might stand up under such a hail of lead and iron as beat upon the Diana's decks from every quarter. Her cannoneers were driven from their pieces in the casemates. They scarcely fired a dozen times against the fire of the Confederate infantry and artillery." So after losing their captain, the Diana surrendered, was captured. They lost the 3 artillery pieces on the Diana and the 150 men. However, 4 men escaped, got back to Brashear City to tell the tale, and it really spooked the rest of the crews of the gunboats. Because they could do that to that Diana, what can they do to the rest of them, especially if only one can get up at a time? So, however, keep in mind the Diana, because it'll play an important part later on in the story. This was an interesting painting that I just happened across while doing this research. It was on the cover of a book about the war in Louisiana, And I wrote down, there's a painting called Ambush at Bayou Teche by Mark Lemon, which supposedly is supposed to portray the ambush of the Diana. So Fort Bisland and Irish Bend. Let's talk a little bit about how these battles kind of shook out, starting with Fort Bisland. They happened almost simultaneously. Fort Bisland started initially, and then later on, Irish Bend happened. So here's Banks' strategy, really Weitzel's strategy. I'll read you off here. This is what he wrote to Major General Halleck on April 10th. He said, I propose to disembark Grover with the object of taking the enemy in reverse and cutting off his retreat, coming around here around the rear. The best say that our steamers cannot come closer than about 1.25 miles from shore, meaning on Grand Lake. They can't, as far as they know, they can't get any closer than 1.25 miles. They can't get their transports to the shore of the lake to disembark. So they're going to bring flatboats to try and work that out. From this distance, a disembarkation must be by the flats, which we have collected. Using all the expedition possible, Grover cannot reasonably be expected to land and take a position in less than 12 hours. The timing of this is really important. And how often is the timing involved in these battles? And if the timing isn't correctly, some things don't go quite right. The moment Grover passes Pattersonville, or Fort Bisland is a little town called Pattersonville, he knew when the flotilla gets past Fort Bisland, the Confederates were going to see it and know that they were going past where his position was. The enemy will certainly take the alarm, and if we let night interrupt the landing, he will escape. We do not move against the enemy at Bisland in front today, as I do not wish him to take the alarm any sooner than we can possibly help. However, he says, if he, Taylor, stays where he is and Grover gets into position before we attack in front, we shall destroy him. So the idea is if we can get Grover disembarked off those transports and get this road that comes behind it, it's Taylor's only route of retreat, then they have him. They have him and they can destroy and capture the entire Confederate army. This area here, this town of Franklin, keep that in mind. That's going to be a very important part of this whole scenario. This is about 16 miles to Fort Bisland, from Fort Bisland to Franklin, and it's about 20 miles from where they get to the Bayou Teche to Fort Bisland. To give you some idea of the distances here. So, also Banks to Halleck, and I read this, and what comes to mind is, before you start a large operation, well, to use a large operation, never tell your boss that everything promises success. Because you just, in Louisiana, we call that a gree-gree, which is a bad voodoo jinx. Everything. He says, having destroyed, or when I destroy the enemy's forces and his salt works at New Iberia, I propose, if time permits, to push a force as far as Opelousas. So his plan was to go and capture what is now the capital of Louisiana. So, April 9th, Banks moves his land attack force of about 10,000 out of Brashear City towards Fort Bisland. April 12th, Grover's fleet gets underway from Brashear City into the lake and starts making its way up Grand Lake at the same time, from the 9th to the 12th. He's got 4 gunboats, the Clifton, the Estrella, the Arizona, and the Calhoun, and several transports, including the Laurel Hill, the Quinnebog, the St. Mary's, and several flats and small steamers. Banks his land forces reach Bisland that night at about 5:30 p.m. and they start to move towards the fort. They report that they were met by grape and canister from the fort. Now, he was moving slow because he didn't want to spook Taylor, and he didn't want Taylor to retreat too quickly. So the strategy is we want to press Taylor in Fort Bisland, but we don't want to press him too hard to cause him to leave before Grover gets into place behind him. So that's the key, the timing of getting these forces in position. So what is Fort Bisland? Let's talk a little bit about what it looked like, what it consisted of. These two pictures here are not Fort Bisland. They're from outside of Atlanta, but they give a pretty good idea of what I think Bisland looked like. So it's described as having chest-high works, extending 1,000 yards from each bank of the Bayou Teche. So Bisland is here, white here. How did that R get out of place? That wasn't there before. Wow. It must be. Yeah, I don't know how that R got. How did the R get there? But this was the narrowest area between those two geographical areas that they could find, and that's why this area was so important. That's why they just couldn't put this fort anywhere, because they had to protect both flanks. So Fort Bisland had 18 guns, pretty much 12 and 6-pound field pieces from the 1st Louisiana Field Artillery, also known as the St. Mary's Cannoneers. And these were all local boys, because the parish, what we call parishes down there, or counties here, the parish there was St. Mary Parish. So all these people in this artillery unit were from here. They were from this actual area. So the St. Mary's Cannoneers, which had their flag captured here, the 5th Louisiana Artillery, and the Valverde, Texas Battery, who came with Sibley. In the front of Fort Bisland was a deeply furrowed sugarcane fields, which they had cleared to clear that field of fire, but it was going to make it difficult for the Federals to approach. The Federals did bring a pontoon bridge. One question I had here, and I couldn't find the answer to it. So all the maps show this. The Federals did bring a pontoon bridge so they could move troops from either side of the bayou whenever they wanted to. I don't know what happened to Cornet's Bridge. Surely the Confederates would have burned it or destroyed it. I just couldn't find any accounts of that. But I'm sure it wasn't there, or it wasn't usable, because they had to use a pontoon bridge. And we talked about the fact that Banks didn't want to push them too hard. So Taylor had the southern side and 1,500 troops on the other side to oppose Banks. At this point, they thought all the Federal forces that were coming were in their front, because Grover had not passed with this flotilla yet. April 12th, as General Alfred Mouton said, the enemy threatening to storm our works, our men fixed bayonets and resolutely prepared to meet and dispute with them to the death the possession of the entrenchments. At this point during the battle on the 12th, the Federals see a familiar boat coming from behind Fort Bisland up the bayou towards them. It's the Diana, and it's flying a Confederate flag now after it had been captured. This was really interesting as well. So the bayou runs that way. So as the Diana is coming down the bayou, it's floating down with the bayou, with the current, but it wants to be able to get down and fire and get back into some safety. So I thought this was interesting, and I thought it was very strange until I could find it in at least two sources. So this is what was described that the Confederates did with the Diana, as described in the History of the 19th Army Corps and in the book main book that I used for this, written by Morris Raphael. So the Confederates set up the Diana by a system of ropes that they could pull the boat out into the current, let it float down the bayou until it got to such a point to where it could fire on the Federal forces. It would fire all of its guns, and then they would use the ropes to pull it back up the bayou into safety, back to where it couldn't be fired on until they could reload, and then they would let it float back down. It was described as by a system of ropes that they could pull the vessel out into the bayou, let it drift down, fire, then they could pull it back upstream and out of sight until it was ready to fire again. which is really interesting to me. The Confederate captain of the Diana at this point is O.J. Sims, not O.J. Simpson. O.J. Sims. Is there another Sims that we know of? Yes, Raphael Sims, the captain of the commerce raider Alabama. That O.J. Sims, the captain of the Diana, that was his father, the captain of the Alabama. You see all of these connections. So during the fighting on the 12th, Grover's flotilla down Grand Lake and is spotted by the Confederates. Now Taylor knows they're up to something. They're sending troops behind us somewhere. I just don't know where they're going to go. I don't know if they're going to land, where they're going to land, or what they're up to. So he sends a cavalry unit along with some artillery to track the Union flotilla up the lake. Find out where they're going. If they try to land, contest the landing, and let me know. Because now he's trying to hold the Federals back in his front at Fort Bisland, and now the Federal flotilla is getting around his rear, but he doesn't know exactly what they're wanting to do. So he's got cavalry and artillery tracking the Federal flotilla. April 13th, the next day, at the end of the day, Banks pretty much approached Fort Bisland late in the day, about 5:30 in the evening, did some fighting, and then withdrew. He didn't want to push Taylor too hard because he didn't want Taylor to leave during the night because he wanted Grover to get in place. The next day, April 13th, renewed the battle, and they started to push towards Fort Bisland. They didn't want Taylor to leave, but they wanted to keep him occupied and keep him in the fort. The Diana kept coming down and getting pulled back and firing at the Federal forces. And at some point in time, they had enough. So Brigadier General Richard Arnold, who was the 19th Army Corps' chief of artillery, ordered the 21st Indiana, which is then pictured here from, they were in this picture, they were in Baton Rouge, ordered them to focus their fire on the Diana to take it out so that it would quit harassing them. And it did. It said the third and fourth shots from this battery, the 21st Indiana, at a distance of over 2,000 yards, completely disabled that Diana and forced her to retire up the river and out of range, and she was not going to engage the rest of the day. She was out of service the rest of the day. So all this is going on, and this is great. Banks is pushing, Banks is fighting, Taylor's holding him off. But where's Grover? Nobody knows where Grover is at this point. Has he landed? Did he get into trouble? They had sent gunboats up Grand Lake numerous times, and they always got caught on a sandbar. They always got stuck somewhere. So he had no idea where Grover's at. Did Grover meet disaster? Did he try to land and was repulsed? No idea. We don't know where Grover's at this point. Where's Grover? At 4 o'clock, from behind the Union lines, was fired. It explodes over the Confederate works. Everybody turns around and is like, where did that come from? They turn around and it's USS Clifton from Grover's flotilla. The Clifton has arrived, and that was the signal to say Grover has landed, and we're here to tell you that. Confederates had no idea what it meant, but Clifton was there to tell Banks that Grover had landed somewhere. Taylor didn't find out that Grover had landed from his cavalry that he had sent until 9 o'clock that night. Once he finds that out, they say, hey, the Federals have landed. Here's where they are. We couldn't keep them from landed, and they're coming. They're going towards Franklin. So Taylor is now in a race. He has to balance holding Banks at Bisland, and he's got to send some of his forces back to try to hold the Federals from cutting off his line of retreat. He's got to try to get out of the trap. So let's go back to April 12th. We're going to go back a day and talk about Irish Bend. So Bisland is happening. Banks is pushing against Bisland, trying to hold Taylor in the fort, trying to give Grover time to land. We're going to go back to April 12th. Grover goes up Grand Lake, attempting to land somewhere near where the bayou is and the road is. There's been delays. Sure enough, one of the transports, one of the gunboats, the Arizona, has run aground. It had a regiment on it. They were able to transport much of the regiment off of it to another boat, but 400 troops were left on that. They finally got it out the next day, and were trying to catch up to the rest of the division. The Confederate cavalry can't keep up with them. When Grover's going up the lake, the cavalry and the artillery are trying to track him, but they can't keep up with him. So they know they're going to land somewhere up here, and they're going up the lake to try and find out where that's at. Grover arrives in the area, scouts a couple of landing areas. The first one he scouts out close to here, and bayou finds out that the roads are impassable, they're flooded. So he goes a little farther up the bayou and lands at the upper bend here. The situation is better than they thought. The boats can get within about 100 yards of land. And they find out that it's shallow enough and the floor of the lake is hard enough for infantry to wade ashore, which they start doing. So the infantry don't have to take boats. However, they use the flats to transport artillery and equipment from the gunboats and from the transports. Here's a portrayal of what that looked like. One of the transports was the Laurel Hill, and sure enough, you can see it's identified as the Laurel Hill here. So what they're portraying here is the landing of the federal forces from Grand Lake to near Bayou Teche onto land. The Confederate cavalry and the artillery show up during the landing and try to contest the landing, but it's a little bit too little and too late. They're not able to do it, particularly because the guns from the gunboats are also operating against them and pushing them back. So they leave, they go back towards Franklin, back towards where Bisland is. Grover makes his landing. He lands his entire division by 4 o'clock, and he wants to land the entire division before he moves forward, which he does, and that takes a little bit of time. Grover lands at 4 o'clock and begins his movement from Grand Lake up here. He lands here and begins to move towards the bayou. So you can see the bayou here, and you can see the road. Their objective is to get across this road. As far as they know, if they get across that road, they're directly on Taylor's route of retreat, and they have him. This area, why is it called Irish Bend? It was also called Indian Bend. The previous picture did, I think, call it Indian Bend. Forces at Indian Bend. It's better known as Irish Bend after U.S. Senator Alex Porter, who owned a house in the area, who was Irish. It was initially called the Irishman's Bend and then just shortened to Irish Bend. The house is still there, and you can visit it, that he owned. In fact, it was owned by the governor of Louisiana, Mike Foster, back in the 1980s. It's called Oak Lawn, and you can visit it. It's actually still there. It was built in 1838. So Grover decides to land his entire division before pursuing the Confederates. Completes the landing at 4. By 6 a.m., they start to move. They're on the move towards the bayou. The Confederates, when they came and retreated, bridge here. Grover sends people ahead to try and capture the bridges and put the fires out, which they do. They were able to salvage the bridges so they can get across. So Grover gets his entire division down to the bayou, across the bridge, and camps here on the night of April 13th. So he stops. That's going to be key to what happens here. But in his mind, I'm on the road. I'm directly on the road that Taylor has to use to retreat. He's got to get through me in order to leave, so we've got him. So there were some consequences to Grover's delay. This is the night when Grover camps that Taylor gets word that Grover has landed and starts to withdraw from Bisland, or at least some of his forces. So Grover was about 6 miles from the town of Franklin, which is going to be key. What the Federals didn't know is that Franklin really is the key here, not the Teche road that they're on. Franklin, the town of Franklin, is the key. We'll get to that here in just a second. So, early the next morning, April 14th, Grover's on the move pretty early. Banks had ordered Grover, once he gets on that Bayou Teche road, to basically take a left and come back south towards Bisland, which is what he does. He gets on the road and turns and starts to march down the road towards the town of Franklin down here. The evening of April 13th, the previous evening, he had about 500 or 600 Confederates that were contesting him. By the time he got on the move the next morning, that number was up to about 1,200 because the first lead elements from Bisland, led by Taylor, were starting to reach the area of Irish Bend and reach the area of Franklin. So Taylor was moving some troops up from Bisland to reinforce this holding force to keep Grover back. What the Federals don't know at this point, so they think that once they get on this Bayou Teche road, that Taylor is caught. They've closed the trap. You can see here, here's the bend here, here's that bend here on the map. What they don't know, the town of Franklin is here, there's a cutoff road. So instead of Taylor having to take this road around the Bayou Teche to continue his retreat, he just needs to get to Franklin. He needs to secure Franklin long enough for his army from Bisland to get to that cutoff road and keep going towards New Iberia and keep going to get out of the trap. The Federals don't know that at this time. At this point, although she was put out of commission the day before at Fort Bisland, the Diana shows up again and anchors the right flank of the Confederate forces that are here. So the Confederate forces, they place their forces anchored on the Diana, some artillery. Their left flank is anchored on this impassable swamp and a dense canebrake, with the woods here and sugarcane at canebrake right in their front. Grover approaches this area with 3 brigades. There's Burge, Dwight, and Kimball that he's moving forward at, with Burge in his front. So the Battle of Irish Bend begins. Grover's men, of course, outnumbers the Confederates. He's got 3 divisions and about 8,000 troops. Taylor at this point has 1,200 in his front, a holding force at least to try and get the rest of his troops behind him and past that cutoff road. So Grover sends 1 brigade forward, Burge. There's some pretty sharp fighting. It's described by the 52nd Massachusetts as being sharp, obstinate, and bloody. They repulse Burge's brigade that morning, pushes back. Grover brings Burge back. He starts to consolidate his division. While he's doing that, more Confederates show up from Fort Bisland. So here, it's interesting here. So here's a portrayal from Harper's Weekly showing the battlefield of Irish Bend. You see the Federal forces here, the woods, Nearson's woods in the back. They show the canebrake here, so the Confederates are in the cane and in the woods. You can see the road. There's the Bayou Teche road to the left, and then just past the road would be where the Bayou Teche is, and that would be where the Diana is, somewhere in here, firing on the Federal forces. The next picture I got here that portrays the battle is the right flank of the Federal Army at Irish Bend. This is identified here. It's hard to see, but this flag here says 6th New York from Dwight's brigade. And you can see them. Here's Nearson's woods. You can see the road here and the woods that are along the trees that are along the Bayou Teche. So we're on the right flank looking across the battlefield towards the Bayou Teche. So Mouton, who was at Bisland, so Taylor left Mouton at Bisland, went to Franklin to try to organize something. Mouton comes up with troops. He takes over the battle at Irish Bend, and Taylor goes to Franklin to try to organize a retreat in the town of Franklin along that cutoff road that we talked about earlier. So Dwight's brigade of Grover's division is in the front now and is pushing the Confederates in Nearson's woods. But Mouton's able to hold him off until about noon, until about the last of the Bisland troops are starting to pass in his rear through Franklin to exit the area and get past the Federals. The Diana covered Mouton's withdrawal and then was scuttled and set on fire, and that was the end of that gunboat. So what the Confederates are trying to do here is coming behind the rest of Taylor's forces from Fort Bisland. Franklin is here. Here's that cutoff road the Federals don't know about, and it crosses the Yoakley Bayou. There's a bridge here. So as Mouton's holding Grover back while the rest of the Confederates get across that road and across that bridge, Taylor orders Sibley to burn that bridge once everybody gets across, which he does, but he forgot to tell Mouton that he was doing that. And Mouton and the other Confederate forces at Irish Bend don't know that the bridge is on fire now. So near Confederate disaster, Mouton is able to pull his forces back across the bridge just in time as it was burning to retreat. The crew of the Diana were not so lucky. They did not get across the bridge before it was destroyed, and they were all captured. This was interesting here. I found this in a, that's going to keep happening. I found this in a northern newspaper. I can't remember which one it was, but they were reporting the Battle of Irish Bend. And apparently, I guess Sibley wasn't that well thought of, especially by the individual troops. So they interviewed and got some Confederate Irish Bend. They talked about that, yeah, Dick Taylor was there, advanced in force on the flank. And they said, Sibley was there, they say, but he was not in the fight and never is. And that was from some Confederate troops. So apparently he was not that well thought of. And he did screw up that day, but ended up being okay. They got across the bridge. So the Confederate army escapes to fight another day. They get across, they head towards New Iberia. So here's Franklin. Battle of Irish Bend happened here. Banks is right behind him, pushing him. They camp the night before, and then they pursue him the next morning pretty quickly. So Albania plantation just outside of Jarrett. I used to walk down the tracks from my house, down the tracks to Albania Woods, and me and my friends used to play in the woods around Albania Mansion all the time. I had no idea that this was involved in here, and there was actually a skirmish the next day between rearguard action of the Confederates and the advance units of the Federal Army right at that area. So the next day, night of April 14th, rather, Taylor's men camp at Jeanneret near Albania Plantation, about 15 miles north of Franklin. There's a rear guard fight at Jeanneret that we talked about, and then Taylor keeps moving north. Dwight's brigade enters New Iberia here the next day on the 16th, and April 17th, Kimball's brigade of Grover's division is sent to Avery Island to destroy the salt mine, which they do. They find once they get there, the Confederates had abandoned it. They did put some infantry and artillery there previously, but they abandoned it, and they were able to destroy the salt mine once they got there. April 17th was the Battle of Vermilion Bayou with the Confederates on one side of the bayou, the Federals on one side. He held them off. Taylor held the Federals off for about 4 hours to continue his retreat as a rearguard action. April 20th, Banks enters Opelousas and captures Opelousas, the Confederate capital. At that point, the Confederate capital is moved from Opelousas to Shreveport, which is on the Arkansas-Texas border in that northwestern corner of Louisiana. Taylor withdraws all the way to Shreveport. On May 7th, Banks entered Alexandria, which is north of Opelousas, up here a ways. May 14th, by that time, Banks had cleared out central Louisiana. He had occupied Opelousas and Alexandria. And at this point, he decides Taylor has gone north. He's no longer in the area. So he's going to turn towards Port Hudson. So he turns right, heading towards the investment of Port Hudson at this point. So what did we accomplish here? What did Banks accomplish here? Quite a few things, actually. Yeah, Banks goes towards Port Hudson. At this time, Grant is starting to approach Vicksburg. Let me go back. So what did Banks accomplish here? So he did secure the western side of the Mississippi River in order to coordinate with Grant. He did clear out South Central Louisiana of all Confederate forces. He did cut Port Hudson's supply line from the interior of the state. He did destroy the salt mines at Avery Island, and he did capture supplies. He captured sugar, sugarcane, and about 3,000 or 4,000 bales of cotton for the Union. But he failed to close the trap on Richard Taylor. Richard Taylor's army got away and was going to continue to harass the Confederate Louisiana till the end of the war. Banks blamed Grover's slow movements at Irish Bend. He blamed him that he stopped and spent the night on the 13th. Blamed him that it took him so long to move the 6 miles from where he landed at the bayou to get to Franklin. However, they didn't know of that cutoff road. That was really the key of what happened there. So he blamed Grover's slow movements, but the lack of knowledge of that cutoff road was really the key to what happened here. So Taylor's army is still in the field. So with Banks investing Port Hudson, Taylor is free because his army is still intact to come right back down, and he retakes all of South Central Louisiana. Banks had left some holding forces at some of the different areas to hold those areas, gather up supplies, and bring them back down to Brashear City, back down here, and get them to New Orleans. So Taylor takes back all of South Central Louisiana and gets to this point down here. At this point, Banks is investing Port Hudson. So Taylor gets the idea that while Banks is up at Port Hudson, I'm going to try and retake New Orleans. By the time he gets to do that, Port Hudson surrenders after the longest siege in American history up till that point. Vicksburg surrendered July 4th, as everybody knows. Port Hudson, once they heard that Vicksburg had surrendered, the jig was up. There's no reason to stay, so they surrendered a few days later on July 9th. Taylor hears that Port Hudson has surrendered, and now Banks's army is free. So he decides not to threaten or to try to retake New Orleans. He moves back to Alexandria, which is north of Opelousas, right in the center here, and sets up his headquarters there. So how did it shake out later on? He moves to Alexandria. This culminates ultimately in 1864 in the Red River Campaign with Taylor versus Banks once again. Banks comes up. Banks wants to get into Texas. So he goes up the Red River past Alexandria and fights a couple of pretty significant battles with Taylor at Mansfield and Pleasant Hill, just south of Shreveport, which ends up Union wins one, the Confederates win the other one, but Banks ends up retreating from that area and almost gets caught because his flotilla and his gunboats almost get caught in low river levels, but he manages to escape. But Banks withdraws from the Red River Campaign, April 1864, and then he ends up being relieved and recalled to Washington. Taylor stays in the area and kind of continues to harass the Federals to the end of the war. So casualties at Fort Bisland and Irish Bend. 224 at Fort Bisland, 335 at Irish Bend, total of 579 between the two of any captured, wounded, or killed. The Confederates lose 450 at Fort Bisland. Unknown how much they lose at Irish Bend. So 450 plus. But it's believed that they did lose more than the Federals did in the entire campaign for Bisland and Irish Bend. What do these places look like now? There's nothing of these battlefields has been preserved. This is the battlefield at Bisland on the south side of the bayou, Sibley's side, the main area where the Federals were. If you can see, there's a circle here that's a tree. As I was growing up, there's a highway that runs, Highway 90 runs right along the side of it with a bridge right before it. And every time we would come across that bridge, I was always told to look to the left. I was told, you see that tree out there in the field all by itself? That was the center of Fort Bisland on this side of the bayou. I don't know whether that's true or not, but that's what I was always, and it was in the right spot for it to be. So there's a historical marker there for the Battle of Bisland. The sugarcane farmers, the guys that owned and farmed this property, were constantly digging up relics along this area, constantly digging up relics. But it's not been preserved. The floodway protection levees, channel dredging, agricultural development have been built over during the 1930s and 40s over Bisland. The Bayou Teche Navigation Project and the Atchafalaya Basin Floodway Project have pretty much taken over that area along with the sugarcane fields. Irish Bend today is basically sugarcane fields, woods, and residential houses in the area, and this is kind of what it looks like. There are historical markers. I've been told that this historical marker is gone now. I haven't been down there to look. I meant to go down there this last time, but I wasn't able to get down there. So there were historical markers, but none of the battlefields have been preserved, and they're all pretty much private property. I did read that portions of what remained of the CSS Cotton were found, but removed by the U.S. government in 1871, or shortly after the war. And that, my friends, is the battles of Fort Bisland and Irish Bend. Small as they were, but pretty significant if you look at the whole campaign of the Vicksburg, Port Hudson campaign and how it affected those. Anybody have any questions? If I can answer them. Yes, sir.
Are those bayous tidal?
What's that?
Are the bayous tidal?
Tidal? I believe they are, but not significantly. The Bayou Teche never really floods, but I think the levels of them do change.
So how do they get the ships up there? I mean, those are significant ships.
Yes, and that's why they could only get one at a time. It was narrow in some places. It was able to get up there. It's a pretty good navigable waterway for moving goods and supplies, which they did. But as far as those gunboats, it was only big enough, especially in certain areas, to get one gunboat up there at a time, which is why the Cotton was successful for holding them off for such a long time, because the Federals, although they had 4 gunboats, they could only fight the Cotton one gunboat at a time.
So they were able to bring those up from the world somewhere.
Yes. Yes.
They didn't build one.
No, they didn't. They didn't build them there. They were built, in fact, the Cotton originally, which was a Confederate boat, was built in Indiana, and it was a Mississippi River steamer and was eventually captured by the Confederates and turned into a gunboat. Yes, ma'am.
Chris, thank you so much for highlighting this rarely discussed area of Civil War history. You know, it's cool to see. I don't know if any of y'all watched the Game of Thrones, but the prequel of it is currently on. So this is like General Michael's prequel, which is run at the first book Fisher and something.
Yes.
So it's really cool to see him in action there in Louisiana as well. And interestingly, I was just talking about him with a patient of mine who happens to be a direct descendant of one of his associates. So for privacy purposes, we're not going to name you, but I was truly amazed and delighted to have a clinical conversation.
Yeah.
What I wanted to ask you, you know, as you said, history is story. So the ancestors of yours that you mentioned, Joseph, his middle name seems Polish to me.
Lewinsky.
I found out more about him, and it seems like the door of his, when you had a chance to meet, he had from when he was 17 years old.
Yes. Yes.
Tell us more about that.
I don't know a tremendous a lot. I am doing some genealogy on the Rivettes. He was Joseph Levinsky Rivette. The Rivettes were the Cajun side of my family, and I can trace them all the way back to Etienne Rivette from Nova Scotia before the French and Indian War, before the Acadians got kicked out by the English. And that's in what happened eventually is they got kicked out of Nova Scotia, and many of them made their way down to Louisiana. So the Rivettes, the report I have, Etienne Rivette, Michael Rivette, were on a ship that came around, ended up being in the Gulf off the coast of Texas, Louisiana. The ship sank. They made it to the coast. They made it to Louisiana and then petitioned the governor of Louisiana at that time to be able to stay. And that's how they were one of the original Cajun families, Acadian families. But as far as his middle name, it's spelled many different ways with an S-K-I and a Y. So I'm not exactly sure where he got that name from. Yes. Yes, sir.
Two things. Could you tell them what Avery Allen is famous for?
Tabasco,
Yeah.
the McElhaney's family. The McElhaney family lives on Avery Island, and the Tabasco plant is there. They don't grow the peppers there anymore. They grow the peppers in South America, but they bring them up here and then they process it up there. The McElhaney family, if you look on the Tabasco bottle, you'll see McElhaney's and you see Avery Island. The McElhaney's were so powerful and rich in Iberia Parish, which is where that area is, which is where I'm from, that when we switched, I was with the fire department there too. When we switched over to the enhanced 911 dispatch system, and they went, we're going to have to change everybody's address to match the 911 system. And McElhaney said, no, we're not. And they were so powerful and rich that whenever there was a fire on Avery Island, it just said, there's a fire on Avery Island. And we had to go find the smoke. They didn't have addresses. But yes, ma'am.
What happened with the salt works? Did they try to rehabilitate it?
They did, and there were salt works there on Avery Island in that area. Morton Salt owns it now. In fact, back in 1986 or 88, there's a lake there, Lake Penure, and the salt mine, part of the salt mine runs underneath the lake. They were drilling in the lake for, I guess, oil, and they punctured the top of the salt mine, and the lake drained into the mines. And there's video of it. There's a big whirlpool, and there's boats going around and around. There were gardens there. There's beautiful gardens that were all pulled down into the lake. There's a canal. There's a town called Delcom, which is supposedly the shrimp capital of the world. But there's the Delcom Canal, which runs out to the Gulf of Mexico. And it's the first time that people in Delcom came out and saw the Delcom Canal running backwards because it was going towards Lake Penure because it was draining, which is interesting. But you can go there. You can tour the Tabasco plant. You can see a video of the Lake Penure disaster and that type of stuff. Yes?
There's, most people don't know a lot about it, but there's some real interesting history of ironclads on the Mississippi River.
Yeah.
And my question is, this is not in this story, but how far south did they go? Did you have any info about that?
How far south in the Mississippi River?
How far south in the Mississippi River?
Well, the Federals captured, early on in 1862, captured New Orleans, coming up from Fort St. Philip and Fort Jackson. So they came up from the south, captured New Orleans, ended up capturing Baton Rouge, and then also coming down, they came down the Mississippi River, so they were coming actually towards each other. I don't know, I don't know how far, anybody know if they had ironclads down where New Orleans was?
Yeah, they were used in Vicksburg.
Yes, yeah, the Cairo was in Vicksburg.
So what happened to Taylor after the war?
That's a good question. I didn't do that much research into what happened to Taylor. He survived the war, I believe. I don't know if he went back to his plantation in St. Charles. St. Charles Parish is right outside of New Orleans, which is where his sugar plantation was. But I'm not exactly sure what happened to him afterwards. It's a good question. I'll have to find out.
Thank you so much.
Yep, thank you.